I wanted just to speak about web isolation and just talk through some of the fundamentals of web isolation, talk about how Symantec have introduced this into their portfolio, and then we'll take a look at a demo of the system to see how this looks from an end user perspective. And I'm happy to take questions as we go, and then we'll talk about those questions at the end. So web isolation is here because there's an existing threat that exists within our security stack. For those of us that have proxies in the infrastructure, you're aware of the concept of URL categorization and the fact that sometimes maybe there isn't a category. This could be new sites, things like this. So there's an exposure at the moment that we're trying to block with isolation. So we've got the concept of the known good websites and known bad, and they're easy to deal with in web policy. What we have is a risky subset of traffic in the middle there, and then it's always a question, isn't it? Do we allow these sites? Do we block them? We don't want the problem of over-blocking, but we do want to have a secure environment. And that's where web isolation comes into play. It can be easily integrated with existing proxy services or email services. And what it allows is the ability to have end users access these websites that may cause us a security concern, but not have the risk of having internet content ever reach the endpoint. So web isolation itself takes the user's request for a website and it downloads, executes and renders that website in a secure network isolated environment and then delivers the visual representation of that into the user's browser. So the end user browser doesn't have to execute any internet code. It's all done at a network level in a very secure, locked down, disposable container. And then we can feed just a visual representation of that website to the user. So we can now let the users browse to some of these websites, and we can feel safe in opening up that access. So the architecture of the system then is the internet content on the right of this diagram comes into our web isolation platform. We download the content that makes up the website. We execute all of the dynamic code, and then we render that in the isolation chamber as to what does that look like? What does the website look like? And then that enables us to feed that visual stream into the user's browser. So this is all based on HTML5 and WebSockets, and all modern browsers support that technology. So in terms of integration and compatibility, we can run this solution on any browser, on any operating system, and we don't require an agent. So there's no endpoint agents needed to run this service either. So it's all delivered over the user's browser. So this can be websites. It can also be documents that the user's trying to access. So we can do a document isolation as well. And then we can also integrate with email systems. So we can actually transform embedded URLs in emails. So instead of when the user clicks it, it downloads that website, it actually sends them to an isolated view of whatever that hyperlink points to. So this is a great way to stop things like phishing attacks or malicious emails that may point the user to download dropper files or malicious content. it's a great way to overcome those security hurdles as well. So we've got three main use cases for web isolation. And the first one really is to try and stop the overblocking problem we see in web policies at the moment. Yep, so this is where maybe you block the uncategorized content, or maybe you're blocking categories that you don't feel is safe to expose to your users. And what isolation does here, it allows you to open those up, but layer on the security as well. Yep. So that's the first use case, is really the overblocking part. We've then got maybe additional protection for privileged users, or maybe high-profile users, high-target users. Yep. So maybe you want all of their browsing through an isolated environment. So this could be, maybe the executives of a company, or maybe the HR department of a company. Maybe they need to access websites that ordinary users don't need access to, but you don't really want those websites to have to run on the user's browser. So additional protection there, maybe for a subset of users, where you want their web browsing to be isolated. And then the third use case is, maybe to stop some of the phishing attacks and the embedded URLs in email links and things like this. So web isolation bridges a security gap there as well. So if we look at the flow for maybe some of the uncategorized or potentially risky categories you might choose. So the diagram here is a typical diagram of a Symantec proxy customer, where you've got the proxy. You might have content analysis devices hooked onto that as well. You're connecting into the Symantec Intelligence Services system for your categorization, and maybe you've got DLP as well. And existing policies would be, you've got a subset of the web that you allow, trusted sites, categories, etc. A subset where you block, so these are definitely categories you wouldn't want to come through your environment, bad sites, etc. And what we're offering with isolation is now a third policy action, where we can isolate traffic, allow the user to access, but actually send that traffic into an isolated container. So the endpoint never sees internet content for these sites. So completely away from the end user. So this could be the uncategorized, and it could be any category you choose. Maybe there's some categories you would prefer to sort of be away from the end user browser. And isolation can also leverage the Symantec attached services as well. So, we can still content scan, we can DLP, we can do all of the acceptable usage that you've currently got configured, would also be true in the web isolation access as well. So very easy integration with Proxy SG. It's just a case of forwarding rules. There's actually a wizard you can go through as well when you integrate Symantec isolation into this. There's a nice, easy to use wizard. End users. This is pretty much transparent to an end user. You don't necessarily see any difference when you incorporate isolation into the policy like this. The users will just browse to a website. The proxy detects that the website should be isolated, so that could be based on category, it could be based on risk score, it could be based on the user or the group that they're a member of, and the traffic is then sent onto isolation, and the website's delivered back to the user in a seamless fashion. So there isn't really any end user perception that anything's different. It's just they don't have to execute internet code on their browser. We do that for them. And then maybe we've got the privileged users here. So this, like I said before, this may be a subset of users within your organization that maybe you want a little bit of extra protection for those users. So maybe all of their web traffic could go through an isolated view. Sometimes we see maybe the HR department, if they receive CVs, into the environment, they have to open up those CVs on a separate device, perhaps. Whereas if we used isolation, then we can just stick with a single device for the HR staff, and we can isolate their traffic. So there's lots of different use cases in that scenario, but this is extra protection maybe for privileged users. And that's how that would look. So the privileged users would talk normally to the proxy system in the infrastructure, and then we've got that trigger that says, well, actually, we need to isolate this traffic for these users. We've got phishing protection built into the solution as well, so we can detect when the user's perhaps putting in credentials on a risky or a non-trusted website, and we can interact with the user and maybe stop them inputting credentials. And then we can also look at emails coming through, and we can transform those URL links embedded in emails. So when the user, if the user does click these links, they're actually sent to an isolated view of that website, just to maybe protect their endpoint from any malicious content. And there's an example of what that would look like. So we can jump in the way of this traffic and interact with the user. So what I'll do now is jump into a demo. Unless there's any questions so far, we can take questions.
Well, I have seen one question. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, Sie haben weiterhin auf der rechten Seite die Möglichkeit, Ihre Fragen zu platzieren. Nutzen Sie dazu bitte den Chatbereich oder den Bereich Fragen und Antworten. Ich werde Ihre Fragen sehr gerne vorlesen. Okay, Wayne, so one question is, how can a user download the files that he needs?
Okay. What I will do, I will show you the answer to that in the demo, but our document isolation service will initially render the document in isolation and feed a visual representation of that to the user. But there are policy actions you can assign to enable the user to download content. Yep, so it's all policy driven, and you can have the end user actually download content.
Okay, perfect. So we're looking forward to see it now in the demo.
Okay, great. So for the demo purposes here, I'll run two versions of Chrome browser. One version is going direct, and the other version is going through my isolation environment. And what we'll do first, as an example, we'll load up the Google search page, for instance, and we'll take a look at the source code of this, because it's interesting to see. This is the kind of thing we're trying to protect against in isolation. So, I mean, we trust Google, so this is executed here on my browser. But this is all obfuscated JavaScript, and there are pages and pages and pages and pages of script. Yep, and we've let that run on this machine. And we trust it, it's Google, but lots of other websites work in this way, where there's just lots of script, where we don't really know what this is doing. And you know, this is a very basic web page. And this is what we're trying to avoid in isolation, is the user not having to execute internet code. So now this is my browser that goes through isolation. And what I'll do, I'll load up the same page. So I'll load up the Google search page. So we've arrived at the same page. Now if I do the source code of this page, this is very much different. So this is basically one line of code which is telling my browser to point to my isolation container. So this is opening up a WebSocket connection to my remote browser. Yep. So the isolation system has detected I've requested a website. It's loaded a remote browser tab for me in isolation. So this is a new, fresh browser tab, and it's loaded Google in that browser tab for me, and it's fed the visual representation of that back into my local browser. So what I'm looking at now is just an image of what the website looks like. Yeah? That's the source code. It's one line of code. It's just opening up a WebSocket connection. And this is what it looks like. From an end user point of view, I can't tell any difference. I can still type and I get my predictive responses come back. I can do a search. This looks the same. It's the same look and feel. I can still zoom in and zoom out. But if we look at network traffic coming down onto the browser here, you will see it's just images. So as I do a Google search, for instance, you'll only ever see images coming onto my local machine here. Yep. So all of the work is being done in the isolated container. The internet content's being executed away from my machine, and we feed the visual representation of that back into the local browser. We can load up. Check out the news here in the UK. So you see there, I requested the website. It fed that back through isolation, and now it's given me a representation of what that looks like. Again, this screen is just an image representation of the website. And I can show you more visually what's happening here in isolation by enabling something called Debug Canvas. What that's going to show you is the parts of the screen that are having to be updated from my remote browser tab. So as I move my mouse around, you'll see a box appear around the parts of the screen that are being updated. So the parts of the images that are being updated. So you see there's an underline around the menu. So therefore we have to update the screen to reflect that same change. So this gives you an idea of what's happening. So it's not a full screen refresh. It's not a video stream. It's a very optimized partial image update of the screen. So again, we could still click on the hyperlinks. We could scroll through the website. This is visually showing you the images that are being updated. So again, coming down onto my machine, our safe visual stream from isolation, all of the dangerous internet code is being executed away from my machine. We can log into something like web email. So again, we can load up Google Mail. Now you notice this automatically logs me in. So what isolation can do is also leverage your cookies. Yeah. So the aim is to have a great end user experience, and for that we need to leverage cookies like the native browser would. Yeah. So we want it to log us into automatically, like it would on our native browser. So isolation can have cookie persistency there. So for services like Google Mail and other websites that leverage that kind of cookie information, we support that. Here's an example of a document. So I've opened up an email now with, this is a hyperlink to a spreadsheet. And if I click this, ordinarily it would come down onto my local machine. But because we're going through isolation here, when I click this, it's actually sending that spreadsheet into document isolation. Yep, so now what we see is a visual representation of the spreadsheet. Let me just reload that. Okay, there seems to be an issue with this particular one at the moment. What we should see here is basically a visual representation of that spreadsheet. And there's the download link we talked about before. So what this enables you to do is let the users see what that image is, but then we can also have the download option to actually download this file as well. Now in the example here, this is blocked because we've actually embedded a test virus within that spreadsheet. So we can pass these files through signature-based scans. We can also integrate with other security tools like sandboxing, content disarming, all of these kinds of tools we can integrate there, so you can still scan these files before releasing them to the user. Yep. So we've still got an element of security controls there as well. We've got another example here of an attachment, which is a zip file which has a password. Now, ordinarily, your security controls will either allow or block this. With isolation, we can actually prompt the user for the password here. Because we know it's password protected, we can't scan it. So we can just offer the fact that, give us the password, we can scan it, and then we can give you the file. Again, this is policy control, so this is all policy driven, and you can craft this around your own security posture. But it just gives you an idea that we can interact with the user now when he's requesting particular files. We've also got an example here of a phishing website. So this is just an example of a phishing site. This is an Office 365. We can sort of put in some credentials here as if we were going to log in. And as soon as we attempt to type a password, we can have the isolation system, prompt the user to say, actually, based on policy, you're not going to be allowed to put a password in here because we think this is, maybe an identity theft kind of website. What we can also do is put websites in read-only mode. Yep. So, as an example, in my policy, I've set all the translation category to be read-only. So if I load up something like translate.google.co.uk, the system comes and tells me I'm in a protected view, right? So now I cannot type on this website. This is a read-only view. So I can sort of browse around, I can do what I like, but I just can't type in or submit any information. And again, policy controls actually enable the user to enable input. Yep. So you do have a policy rule which says allow the user to override this if they want to. And again, you can prompt the user with the information you need. So we can enable input, and now we can start typing, and the keyboard works as normal. So I've just done a search there for a PDF file. I just wanted to show you the document isolation. So I clicked on the PDF, and what this actually did, instead of downloading it to me, it's put it into document isolation service, which means I can read this file, but the only thing that come onto my local machine was an image of it. Yeah. So this has happened in isolation, and now we can read through this document. But again, locally, it's just image. It's just an image of what we see in the isolation container. And again, we've got the download option there to download this file if the end user does actually need it. So we can click that, and we've got that now. So now actually that's sort of come down onto my local machine. So I'll just step back to this presentation. So in terms of integration with, Proxy SG, this is how the integration would look. So, the user requests a website. Maybe this is a fresh website and not categorized yet. The proxy would then realize it's uncategorized, and would actually send it to the Web Isolation container. The Web Isolation would then go and request the website, which is an external internet site. It's not categorized yet, so we're treating this as suspicious. And then it's going to download, execute, and render that in the isolation container. And it's going to give us a visual stream to actually send back into the user's browser. The user can then click around, they can work as normal, as we've just seen in the demo. But no internet content has reached that endpoint. It's all happened at a network level in a safe, disposable browser tab. And when the user's finished with the tab, they'll shut it down, which means then we kill off the remote browser tab we have in isolation as well, ready for the next session. Melanie, are there any questions? Should we open it up for questions now?
Thank you very much, Wayne. Yes, there is some questions coming in. I'll just read out the first one to you. How do you handle animated content like movies, Flash, or others? Can you convert that in real time?
Yep. Okay. Let's take that example then. So, if we go to YouTube, for instance, what we're doing here in isolation is actually grabbing the stream, the internet stream, and we are removing the player information from that stream. We're injecting our own player on the client side and then restreaming from isolation. Yep, so we're not transcoding the information, but we are removing any player information from that. So videos, etc., they will play, the same speed as they would, natively in the browser. Yep. So video as such doesn't cause isolation any problem. You'd get the same kind of results. Yep.
Perfect, thank you. Then just one question right connected to the previous one. Do I need additional bandwidth for the streaming? What
we're able to do in isolation is to give pretty much the end user experience is just the same as a native browse, and with the isolation modes, we're pretty much at roughly the same bandwidth as well. So there may be a slight uplift in bandwidth, but it's not too much. The way we deliver content is roughly on par with a native browse.
Perfect. Next question. What browsers are supported within the isolation and on the client itself? And what about mobile browsers?
So the browsers that are supported in isolation, so we operate using HTML5 and WebSocket connections. Now all modern browsers support this, right? So we can support IE, Chrome, Firefox. We support all modern browsers. And like I said before, we don't need an endpoint agent. This is all browser-based, and therefore the operating system doesn't matter either. And sorry, Melanie, what was the second part of that question?
What about the mobile browsers?
Yeah, so mobile support is coming soon. It's in development. The whole interaction with the mobile browser is completely different to a desktop browser. Things like finger gestures and two-finger scrolling, all of these things are a completely different experience, virtual keyboard. So the development cycles have taken longer for mobile support, but it is coming towards, I think it's probably 3 months away now, roughly.
Good, looking forward to that. Then the next question, what is the average delay that a user has to deal with?
Yeah, so there's negligible delays when the user browses to a website. So we actually run the Chromium engine in isolation. So we've got a remote browser tab, waiting for user requests. The user hits a website. That gets transformed into isolation. Isolation can go and grab that website, download and render that, and then send the visuals to the user. It's negligible, and from an end user perspective, you can't really tell any difference.
Good. Then one question regarding authentication. What kind of authentication method, such as Kerberos or SAML, are supported?
Yep, so we support AD integration, so we support Kerberos, NTLM, we support SAML, and what we can also do is integrate with existing proxies as well. So we can maybe leverage authentication information that you've already done on the proxy, and we can use that in the exported for headers. So we don't have to have that authentication set at isolation level. We can use information that's already there in the requests, if we're integrating with existing proxies.
Perfect, thank you. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ich sehe, es hat noch 2 Fragen. Bitte nutzen Sie die Gelegenheit, stellen Sie Ihre Fragen auf der rechten Seite im Chatfenster und im Fragen- und Antwortfenster. Wir werden diese gerne jetzt noch kurz beantworten. So Wayne, next question. I think you mentioned it already, but can you maybe answer it anyway? Is it correct that email attachments and browser downloads are not protected?
So if you're accessing web email services, then we protect attachments from webmail, URL links in webmail, that's all covered. If you're using native email clients, then the URLs embedded are going to be protected because they're going to load in your normal browser. What we haven't quite got yet is the isolation for attachments for native email yet. So that's going to be coming. That's roadmap.
Great. Then we have one question. I see there is some more coming in. One question: is web isolation on-premise or cloud-based?
Yep. So web isolation is on-premise. So it's delivered as software at the moment. So it can be deployed on-premise on bare metal or virtual machines. We've also got a managed cloud service as well, so it can be cloud-based. We've got an add-in for our web security service, so that's our cloud-based proxy service, so we can add isolation on there. And we can also deploy it in a customer's cloud as well. So if a customer already has a subscription to cloud-based services, then we can deploy there as well.
Great. And then one last question that is very interesting. What is the difference between Symantec Web Isolation and other isolation concepts on the market?
Yep, so the differentiation for us with Symantec Isolation is the fact that we're completely rendering a website in the isolation container. Yep, so we download, execute and render completely in an isolated container, and then we're sending a safe visual representation of that to the endpoint. Other isolation technologies on the market operate in a different way, where they might look at, maybe HTML and JavaScript and try and do some kind of sanitation to this, but then send other content types directly into the browser, like CSS files, images, and fonts and things like this, which can be exploited. So for Symantec Isolation, the differentiation is we isolate everything. Yep, so your endpoint is completely protected.
Great. Okay, well, a good point to finish. I see there is no further questions coming in. Wayne, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, Ihnen ganz herzlichen Dank für Ihre Zeit, für Ihr Interesse und für Ihre Teilnahme an diesem Webinar. Falls Sie weitere Fragen haben, können Sie uns jederzeit gerne kontaktieren. Wir freuen uns auf Ihre Kontaktaufnahme.